In my last video, Debunking Every Anti-Capitalist Argument Ever, I made reference to two concepts, empiricism and historicism. When I was making that video, my plan was to elaborate on both of those concepts, particularly empiricism, since empiricism is more widespread and is a little bit more in-depth, I think, in a separate video, since I wanted to keep the arguments in that video short. Because of that, my use and debunking, quote-unquote, of empiricism was fairly sloppy and not anywhere near complete. So this video exists to change that and to truly address the empiricist argument completely. Plus, I'm currently in the process of working on two other videos that are going to be fairly long, potentially as long as the last video, and I wanted to make a video that could hold you guys over until those two come out later. Fair warning, this video is going to be pretty technical, similar to my video on argumentation ethics. That said, it probably won't be as long as the other videos on my channel. The arguments I use here are mainly from A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, which I highly recommend. It's by Hans Hermann Hoppe. I think it's a must-read. With the introduction out of the way, let's get into the arguments. So what is empiricism? For one, empiricism is an epistemic position. That is, it relates to how people know things. As explained by Hans Hermann Hoppe, it has this central tenet. Knowledge regarding reality, which is called empirical knowledge, must be verifiable or at least falsifiable by experience. And experience is always of such a type that it could, in principle, have been other than it actually was, so that no one could ever know in advance, i.e. before actually having had some particular experience, if the outcome would be one way or another. If knowledge is not verifiable or falsifiable by experience, then it is not knowledge about anything real, but simply knowledge about words, about the use of terms, about signs and transformation. So essentially the empiricist says, well, statements can be divided into two types, synthetic and analytic. Synthetic propositions are those that can be falsified through experience, and is thus knowledge that pertains to the real world. For example, the claim, aspirin eases the average person's headache, is a synthetic claim, as this proposition could be falsified if, in a controlled environment, the ingestion of aspirin didn't actually ease the average person's headache. Analytic propositions are those that cannot be falsified through experience. The claim, all bachelors are unmarried, is an analytic proposition, since the truth value of the claim is contained within the term. By definition, bachelors must be unmarried, as the definition of bachelor means a man who has not been married. The synthetic proposition given earlier, however, is not analytic, as easing the average person's headache is not contained within the definition of aspirin. So what does this really mean? As I show in the economics section of Against the State and in the basics section of Debunking Every Anti-Capitalist Argument Ever, the arguments used to explain economics from the Austrian school are purely rational, with the exception of the disutility of labor. They are not based on experience, but are rather based on knowledge that can be discovered prior to experience. That is, pieces of knowledge in which the alternative is logically inconceivable. The knowledge that humans behave purposefully is an example of a piece of knowledge that can be gained without experience or observation. It is simply known and is thus referred to as an axiom. All derivations made from that basic axiom must be certainly true then. As a result, the economic realities built off of this axiom can be resembled as a sort of tree. If one argument within the tree is proven to be wrong through reason, the derivations that are based on that argument are also wrong. For example, take the proposition, a minimum wage cannot increase the general standard of living for the affected populace in the long term. This statement was derived from the use of the evenly rotating economy and supply and demand curves. These supply and demand curves were derived from a series of independent property owners' value scales. The existence of independent value scales was derived from the fact that humans are always attempting to gain a psychic profit, which was derived from the fact that humans must make choices, which was derived from the fact that humans act purposefully within time. The purposeful behavior of man is classified as action and is said to be an axiom, the root of the tree. So say you're a socialist. You've just recently discovered the Austrian School of Economics. Maybe you've encountered some rational arguments against socialism or rational arguments supporting capitalism. Maybe you believe there should exist a minimum wage, for instance, but the derivations that the Austrian school lead to state that the minimum wage cannot increase the general standard of living. What would be your plan of attack? Well, you could reject the derivation from the supply and demand curves, or ERE, as valid with some counterargument. Better yet, you could attempt to reject the derivation of supply and demand curves from value scales, as all that follow from supply and demand curves must then be false or be justified through other reasoning. Following this down the tree, you get to the root, human action. What better way is there to disprove the Austrian theory of economics than attacking the very basis of the entire school? This is where empiricism comes in. The empiricist is given the ability to essentially claim that the purposeful behavior of humans as contrasted with the non-purposeful behavior of humans is not something that can be known, since it cannot be falsified. Since all knowledge pertaining to the real world must be falsifiable, the axiom of human action must be nothing but mere words describing other words with no application to empirical reality. The axiom of human action is merely analytic. Thus, the derivations that depend on the certainty of the existence of human action, as described, must fall apart. Now say you're a capitalist. You might think, that's all true, or it might be true, but there's plenty of empirical evidence disproving the socialist points anyway. You can easily compare countries with higher levels of socialism against those with lower levels, and come to the conclusion that capitalism, in terms of improving the general standard of living, is preferable to socialism. This proves that, even after experience, capitalism is preferable to socialism. Empiricism, though, has a secret weapon. Causality involves input and output such that if some event A occurs, event B will come about. The hypothesis between these two events can be stated, if A, then B. To test this hypothesis, one must do A and observe the results. Say A is completed and B arises, as the hypothesis predicts. This does not prove the hypothesis is true, as there could be an indefinite number of instances of A and B in the future, and one of them could be theoretically falsified. As a result, no hypothesis can be guaranteed to be true, only supported and falsified. However, say that one observes A and B does not arise or happen. One would be inclined to say that the hypothesis has been falsified. However, this is also not the case, as it is still possible that there exists a causal relation between A and B, but there was some other factor that was ignored that affected the results of the tests, making the causal relationship unable to be properly observed. As a result, no hypothesis can be certainly falsified either. So, the empiricist can use these conclusions to argue with the capitalist using empirical evidence easily. The capitalist might say the difference in standard of living between East and West Germany is significant, and the socialist empiricist will not deny the existence of the difference. However, the socialist empiricist, unlike the capitalist, will deny that socialism necessarily caused the difference in standard of living, and will instead use other factors to explain the difference away. For example, the socialist may say, well, the aid that streamed into West Germany was far greater than that of East Germany, which may account for the difference. Or, East Germany was more of an agrarian backwater than West Germany before any socialism was instituted. Or, Western provinces got rid of feudalism far before Eastern ones, which account for the differences. Using empiricism, all empirical arguments seemingly in favor of the capitalist mode of production are easily dismissed. The socialist empiricist is given the ability to keep trying. As Hans Hermann Hoppe states, socialism is made immune to any decisive criticism because any failure can always be ascribed to some as yet uncontrolled intervening variable. So then what's wrong with empiricism? As we've established, there are two main kinds of statements according to the empiricist: synthetic and analytic. Synthetic statements are those about reality, and analytic are simply combinations of words that have no real application to reality. But what about the truth of empiricism itself? Is empiricism synthetic or analytic? If empiricism as a proposition is analytic, it doesn't apply to reality and is a mere combination of words, basically just sounds. If this is the case, empiricism doesn't actually say anything, as the description of empiricism is merely contained within its definition and does not apply to the real world by its own doctrine. It is self-defeating. If empiricism is synthetic, it does apply to reality. However, as established earlier, the central tenet of empiricism is a mere hypothesis and could theoretically be falsified in the future. Thus, empiricism as a form of scientific inquiry could at any time be wrong, and all of the derivations made from it be wrong. That said, it could also be right. By empiricism, there'd be no way of knowing whether empiricism is right or wrong. Further, how would you go about proving empiricism wrong? Would you use the empirical method and thus presuppose that empiricism is correct to prove it wrong? However, the position the empiricist takes must presuppose the existence of non-empirical knowledge as knowledge that applied to reality, which proves itself to be even further self-defeating. For example, take the hypothesis, if I drink Soylent, then my testosterone levels will drop. Say that your testosterone levels drop after drinking Soylent. Then, on a second instance, you drink Soylent and your testosterone levels drop again. The empiricists admit that this repetition is not a validation of the hypothesis as truth, but may simply support the hypothesis. It does not prove it. What presupposition must be made to make the conclusion that the repetition supports the hypothesis? The causes of the event must be time invariant. That is, none of the causes or things that are supposed to be being held constant change over time. So, assume time is not invariant, that the body may change between the first and second test, or that the Soylent may change, or some other variable thought to be held constant changes over time. If this is the case, the two observations are merely repetitions and cannot be said to support or reject any hypothesis at all. The two events are completely independent, and no conclusion can be drawn at all. Therefore, in order to falsify or support anything after experience, the observable phenomena must be determined by causes that are constant and time invariant. This is known as the constancy principle and must be assumed to be valid to draw any conclusion from any test at all. If empiricism is a contradictory philosophy, what kinds of things can we know? To answer this question, we introduce two constructs: language, or thought, and action. According to empiricists, language is nothing but a series of conventionally accepted symbols and combinations of those symbols given some meaning by arbitrarily chosen definitions. This point can be easily seen by the fact that there are hundreds of languages spoken all across the globe, and you could even make one up yourself. This makes it seem as if anything relating to language can only be known after some experience. However, this is wrong. The abstract and a priori nature of language can be seen through three concepts: convention, proposition, and definition. Take the empiricist position on language again. A series of conventionally accepted symbols. Okay, but what is a convention? As Hans Hermann Hoppe states, evidently, it cannot be suggested that convention in turn be defined conventionally, as that would simply be begging the question. In order for there to be such a conventional system, it must be assumed that every speaker of a language already knows what a convention is. And he must know this not simply in the way he knows that dog means dog, but he must know the real, true meaning of the convention. As such, his knowledge of what a language is must be considered a priori. Basically, it is true that symbols or noises such as dog can be associated to the physical dog to define the noise dog. However, this cannot be said of convention. People must have some idea of what a convention actually is before convention is conventionally defined. Additionally, knowing the meaning of proposition, which is how to mean something by saying something, is also unable to be learned from experience, but must be assumed for any speaker of any language. Defining what a proposition is involves making a proposition. As a result, the act of attempting to define proposition must be implicitly and already understood before proposition is conventionally defined. Finally, there's definition. So, there exists a set of symbols in what is known as language, which are assigned to things in the world. Book is assigned to book, dog is assigned to dog, soylent is assigned to soylent, etc., etc. This is what we call a definition. When things are defined conventionally, one communicates the symbol and points at the thing, assigning the thing with the symbol. This is fairly simple to understand for the examples that were just shown, but what of the term definition? To define definition, as one would define any of these terms, one would theoretically point to the act of pointing. However, this action would implicitly assume that man already understands what pointing means, as defining definition involves using the meaning of definition before it is conventionally defined, unlike the rest of the terms. Any denial of any of these points would involve using conventional language, making propositions, and using definitions. As a result, the denial would be contradictory and self-refuting. What about action? After all, it is certainly possible that there exists a priori synthetic knowledge, as opposed to a posteriori synthetic knowledge, which empiricists believe is the only type of synthetic knowledge to really exist, like what was illustrated earlier with language, but that action is not an example of a priori knowledge. If this is the case, the Austrian school remains fallen. Fortunately for the Austrian school, this is not the case. Take empiricism once again. Knowledge regarding reality must be verifiable or at least falsifiable by experience. We can easily substitute knowledge of action as an instance of knowledge regarding reality. That is, actions can and must be explained by means of causal hypotheses which can be confirmed or refuted by experience. If this is the case, any test involving human action must be as other empirical tests to be valid. That is, the environment must be sufficiently controlled such that the same variable is being tested. For example, say you want to measure the effects of watching Hassan Piker on brain activity. In order to do this experiment properly, you'd run multiple tests of watching some segment of Hassan Piker and then measure your resulting brain activity. What you wouldn't do is run, say, 5 tests, in which some tests you're using your phone and others you're not, or in some tests you're listening to music as he talks, and in others you're not, or measuring your own brain activity in some of the tests but using some other person's activity in others. In all of these tests, the outside factors that could be influencing the results are not controlled, and thus are not able to support or falsify a given hypothesis. That said, tests involving human action must be time invariant. That is, the variables being tested must not be influenced by time itself, just like it can't be influenced by anything else. The causes of action, then, must not be influenced by time. If it were, the experiment would not be controlled, and 2 observations of similar events must be regarded as mere repetitions, not validations or falsifications. The empiricist has 2 options then. He can assume that the causes with respect to action must be time invariant, or the causes with respect to action cannot be assumed to be time invariant. If the empiricist chooses the first, the experiment can be assumed to be controlled, presuppositions of the constancy principle aside. If the causes with respect to action are time invariant, though, man is unable to learn. He can't change over time. If man is unable to learn, he couldn't adopt the programs that the empiricists wish to adopt. Further, the empiricist would be literally unable to learn anything from the experiment he is attempting to execute. If the empiricist chooses the second, people can learn. However, as illustrated, any experiment involving the causes of action must be time invariant, else the experiment is no longer controlled, and repeated events are mere repetitions or non-repetitions. Either way, empiricism is self-refuting. Additionally, if one can learn from experience, one cannot know what one will know later, and thus, one will only ever be able to understand the causes of one's actions after whatever action took place. Therefore, through reason alone, we can conclude that it can be known a priori that no action can be conceived of as predictable on the basis of constantly operating causes. Causality is also a rule that cannot be conceivably falsified, as all purposeful behavior involves presupposing its existence. That is, the only reason you do things or anyone else does anything is to affect other things. You wouldn't interfere in anything if you believed your action would have no effect on anything at all. The existence of time is also established through action, as whenever one attempts to cause some effect, one must necessarily differentiate between earlier and later. Action also presupposes values, as they are unable to be known by experience. With every action, the actor pursues some goal. They wish to produce a result, as stated with causality, that has the highest value to them. Otherwise, they would pursue a different goal altogether. As a result, empiricism as a philosophy is certainly false. At this point on my channel, socialism as a moral system has been addressed by the video The Ethics of Argumentation, showing that socialism cannot be justified to be moral. After this video, the empiricist position of socialism, the social engineer, has been addressed, showing that there does exist a priori knowledge, and that the truths derived from that a priori knowledge must necessarily be true. Additionally, a defense of capitalism has been provided by debunking every anti-capitalist argument ever. To fully address socialism, then, I must go through as many rational arguments as possible that show why socialism is harmful to a general population. That video is currently in the works. So thanks for watching. As a quick recap of what I said in the introduction, essentially I plan on releasing a few more videos within the coming months. I don't know exactly when they'll be released since my college has started back up and I have a lot of work to get done. That said, I really appreciate you guys sticking around, and I'll see you in the next video.